Okay, the next two chapters are one phylum. Chapter 9 is just an overview of the phylum and two groups that, remember I talked earlier about how animal people tend to divide all the animals between the vertebrates with backbones and the invertebrates without backbones. And the vertebrates aren't even a discrete phylum. They're a subphylum inside the chordates. And the chordates is what we're gonna introduce here. Deuterostomes, right? Same as the echinoderms. These guys, you get a branch here into the chordates. Here's the echinoderms. Here's what I call the arrowworms. They're a little group we didn't talk about. And from this line up, you have the chordates. From this split up, you've got the vertebrates, sort of. We'll talk about that when we get to chapter 10. But there are features that we share with everybody else in the group. A lot of these features are only there in our embryo forms, right? Embryos connect a lot of things that you don't see connections for in adults. But and this actually looks a bit like we looked at a particular embryonic stage. In fact, it looks quite a bit like it, except the eye wouldn't have been there. This red thing is called the notochord. That is what the phylum is named for, the chordates. In primitive chordates, it is a skeletal element. It's kind of a flexible rod that runs front to back, and it gives the muscles something to pull against. So when the muscles bend the rod to swim, when they relax, the rod goes back, and then it can bend the other way. And so it saves muscle energy. Is that we sort of do the same thing when you run, when your foot hits the ground, the way that it flexes the ligaments and to some extent the tendons in your lower leg, they've got enough elasticity that when you come off of the shift your weight and go to come off, is some of that elasticity is translated into push-off, so your muscles are not working quite as hard. So the idea of a flexible skeletal element, there's some upsides to it and there's downsides to it. The downside to it is when a muscle pulls on something that's flexible, it loses some of its force. You pull on something solid, the whole pull goes against it. You pull on something solid that flexes, some of the energy goes into the distortion. In this case, you can make it work for you if you're swimming. Remember the ventral double nerve cord in the annelids and the arthropods? This is the other one. This is a dorsal single hollow nerve cord. In chordates, now we only had this as an embryo. In vertebrate chordates, chordates with backbones, what this does is it's not a skeletal element. It forms in that spot, runs the whole length of the animal from just behind the head to the tail. When the animal is just a long, thin embryo. And so you've got your digestive system, what there is of it, and this notochord running front to back between the digestive system and the back, the dorsal side. That notochord produces a chemical that kind of percolates up to the surface. And up above the notochord, you get a long, thickened plate of cells. So it starts down on the inside, you wind up with a long, thickened plate of cells down the back. Once that long plate is formed, it rolls up into a tube. So when it does that, it pulls the skin on both sides over the top of it. So it becomes a tube inside the body, the dorsal nerve cord, and that's why it's hollow. Even in people our age, is that there's some hollows in the very innermost part of your brain. There's hollows in the very innermost part of your spinal cord. They're not super hollow anymore, but they are technically still a hollow nerve cord. And then this is the digestive system And off of the digestive system, these slits, what they call the pharyngeal slits or the gill slits form. You had these when you were at this age as an embryo. And there are some structures that are suggestive of gill structures at that stage. This is why the guy who did ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny thought we went through a legitimate fish stage as we went through our embryonic development, because he could see things that with what he had in the microscope he had, they looked like very fishy structures. They look like gills. They never become actual gills. They go off to do other things, but long before they form real gill-like structures. But that's why he kind of thought he was looking at fish. But at this stage in development, we and a fish look pretty much the same. These go on to be the gills of the fish. There's outgrowths become our lungs. There's some outgrowths that become jaws and structures in here, all sorts of things. But this is basic features of chordates. One thing that's not on here, but it would be right in here, heart. Chordates have a closed circulation system. They have all their blood circulates in tubes. Well, maybe not all. Your liver's like a big sponge that the blood kind of soaks through. But in theory, we're a closed circulation system like the annelids. And really, we're the only two groups that are characteristically have a closed circulation system. And in fact, when you were an embryo, this would represent you at maybe 3-4 weeks in. You'd be a little bitty thing. This heart would have been beating for a while already. And it would be teeny, teeny, tiny. Is it? Because people go, oh, the heart started beating, they got an ultrasound. Well, it takes a while before that heart is big enough to really show up. Ultrasounds are not, they don't have great resolution. They can't see things that are really tiny. So the heart needs to be big enough so that you can actually see it working in order for there to, or pick up the heartbeat. There are two main groups of invertebrate, non-backboned chordates. There's these guys. There's a cutaway view over here. These are commonly known as the sea squirts. That's a great name, right? They're filter feeders, but then so are these guys. Is that the invertebrate chordates are all filter feeders. These guys are sessile. They sit in one spot. They suck water in and then run it through. In this case, the pharyngeal slits are a filter. And they run it through the filter, catch food, food goes into the digestive system. These kind of sort of look and act like sponges, but they are much more complex than sponges because they got the nervous system and the digestive system and the muscle system. As larvae, they're swimmers. And this is the other subgroup of the invertebrate chordates, commonly known as the lancelets. And these are swimmers. They take food in through their mouth, and then they've got these gill slits. They're also filter feeders. And these look a lot like embryonic forms of later chordates. So I'm going to write some of this stuff down. So chordates. Notochord. Closed circulation. We'll call them gill slits. Just make sure I have. Don't forget that a notochord has two particular uses. In primitive ones, it's skeletal. Excuse me. Later ones, it's used to tell the spinal cord where to form. That's what that hollow tube is going to be. Another thing that's considered to be a characteristic of the group, but doesn't really show up much in these guys, is an endoskeleton, an interior skeleton. Even in the early chordates, it isn't made of bone, it's made of cartilage. And here they do have some cartilage elements, and the notochord is kind of sorta an endoskeleton, although it's not really complex enough to be called a skeleton. So I'm gonna throw it up here just to get it on the list. You know the differences between exoskeletons and endoskeletons, we talked about that. Okay. Here's a lancelet. Food goes in here. Here's the gill slits that the food is filtered through. It goes into the intestine. Another weird feature that chordates have is something called a post-anal tail. Is that in other animals with tails, the digestive system runs through the tail and comes out the very back end of the tail, or really close to the back end of the tail. In chordates, the tail is actually behind where the digestive exit is. Weird feature. Here's your notochord. Here's your dorsal hollow nerve cord. The water, once it's been filtered, goes out through a siphon. Same structure is called that way in clams. And here is, the sea squirts are technically tunicates, but sea squirts is fine. Here's where the food goes in, here's where the food gets filtered, here's where the particles that want to be digested go into the digestive system. There's a heart. They don't show blood vessels, but there's blood vessels. There's a nervous system. They have a little covering called a tunic. They've got a reproductive system, so there's gonads. This holds them down. Here's where the water, after it goes through the filter, where it goes out. Here's the anus. And here's where sperm or egg come out. In this case, they're capable of producing both. Is that they're both male and female, what are called monoecious. We are dioecious, separate males and females. Even in our own phylum, there are things that are male and female at the same time. Okay, that's it for chapter 9.